My name is Ross Johnson. I'm a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center, and it's my pleasure to be chair and perhaps occasional commentator as well in this second panel. As Christian said earlier, there's no iron curtain here between panel 1 and panel 2. We're going to be talking about many of the same issues. And let me just, before introducing our panelists, mention a couple of the issues that we broached, we've talked about before. Just a couple thoughts about a couple of them as perhaps some stimulus to our discussion here in panel number 2. The provenance and nature of the documents, and particularly those released by CIA today. They're packaged a little differently, but they're actually 25 individual documents. And by my reading, and I'd be happy to be corrected, and Wojtek may have a better count than I do, but by my count, 16 of those 25 documents are not to be found on the PHP website or on the Cold War International History Project website. So in that sense, they're new. Now, I may have missed some. And another question that's occurred to me looking at this material is the documents that we have, the great service of the PHP, in both online and in the Cardboard Castle. These documents that PHP collected drew heavily on the East German military archives that ended up of course, in Freiburg in the German military archive. So we're going from German language versions, and in some cases we only have East German notes on the documents and not the documents themselves. And one in particular that I saw, the important parts have been left out in the East German document, at least that's available online. So we've got apples and oranges and pears to compare here. What we don't have, we do not yet have any place, to my knowledge, a Russian original, which is where these, that's where this all started. We've got German translations of Russian. We've got English translations, CIA English translations of the Russian. So far, we don't have any originals. In theory, they should be available. Some of those documents should have been in several of the East European military archives as Warsaw Pact documents affecting everybody in the alliance. So far, we don't have any. We've asked here at the Wilson Center, we've asked our colleagues at the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland if they can find some of these documents in the original Russian or in Polish. Wojtek alluded to what happened with the Warsaw Pact documents in Poland. A few years ago, Radek Sikorski, when he was Minister of Defense, decided to declassify and make available all the Warsaw Pact documents in Polish custody. Quite what that term covered is not necessarily very clear, Warsaw Pact versus non-Warsaw Pact, in the totality of Polish military archives. But that whole set was transferred from the Ministry of Defense to the Institute of National Remembrance, where, according to IPN at least a couple of years ago, about 10% was still considered classified, but the 90% unclassified and available. But I'm not sure how far the processing and finding aids have gone. In any case, we've asked the question, and it'll be interesting to see whether any of these documents turn up in the original Russian or Polish in Poland or any place else. I can't resist sharing another source of information, of course, about the Warsaw Pact. Another important source of information has been refugees and defectors to the government, to the intelligence community. We had discussion here about evaluating the reliability of one individual short in the first session. And I remember a comment one time talking about that individual to somebody who was involved with all that in the intelligence community. And the answer, and it's a cautionary note that applies to evaluating sources of any kind, any place. The comment was, you know, the thing about General X, the longer he's gone from where he came from, the more he knows. And so we always have to keep that in mind. And a couple of the issues that caught my attention as we were having our first discussion. I know I'll turn next when I finish these short comments to Larry Watts, who'll be talking in detail about the Romanian role in all this, which is obviously very, very crucial. Again, what perhaps we can reflect again in the comments and in our discussion, particularly with the 1980 wartime statute. Why did the Soviets bother? Confirmatory, putting down on paper what they were going to do all along. So why did they want to go to all this trouble when they had the dedicated opposition from at least one of their alliance members? And just my last comment here at the outset is just to share what I think a couple of our previous speakers said. Putting this down on paper, and maybe it was a Soviet motivation, but the reason, perhaps, that it was so unwelcome, not just to the Romanians, but clearly to elements of the Polish General Staff and others, was that it was going to further limit any possibility for national decision-making, not in wartime, but in transition to war. And that comes out very clearly in one of these Polish General Staff documents that's in one of the documents that CIA has released here today, that it would, the objection being that it would bypass national authorities in the transition to war. I think that may be the key. At least perhaps we can have some more discussion of that point. Let me now introduce all three of our panelists here on the second panel. In the order in which they'll speak, but I'll make all three introductions right now. First, Larry Watts. He's a former RAND consultant and advisor to the Romanian Defense Ministry and government on military reform and intelligence matters. From 1990 to 2008, he was a senior consultant to Romanian Ambassador Ian Talpis on matters relating to security sector reform, as well as on a project devoted to interethnic mediation. He's authored more than half a dozen books, including Romanian Military Reform and NATO Integration, published in 2002, and a book he was kind enough to just send me with the fine title, With Friends Like These, the Soviet Bloc's Clandestine War Against Romania, published last year. Following Larry's presentation, we'll turn to Walter Yaiko, a retired Air Force Brigadier General, Professor of Defense Studies at the Institute of World Politics here in Washington, and a fellow at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. From 1998 to 2002, General Yaiko was a Defense Fellow in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Between 1994 and 1998, Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Intelligence Oversight, and he's also served as Director of the Special Advisory Staff in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense. Last and not least, Fritz Ehrmart, a colleague of mine from Radio Free Europe and from the RAND Corporation, who served in the Central Intelligence Agency from 1973 until 1998, including service as chairman of the National Intelligence Council, as National Intelligence Officer for the USSR in Eastern Europe, and Director of the Strategic Evaluation Center. Fritz received both the Distinguished Intelligence Medal and the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. During the Reagan administration, he served as special assistant to the president as well as senior director of Soviet and European affairs at the NSC. So, Larry, you're on first.
Thank you very much, Ross. Ross, when he first contacted me, he asked me to provide some context for the Romanian role, and I elected not to go too far afield from the documents, particularly since the original package I was sent was not only contained the CIA declassified documents, but also a number of documents from the Parallel History Project, and in fact, most of this is based on those documents, the two together. The document collection here sheds what I think is new light on why the rest of the Warsaw Pact viewed Romania as an enemy fraternal country. The image of purposeful insistence that emerges from this collection is decidedly different from that circulating during the 1980s when Soviet disinformation depicted Romanian defiance as mindless and ridiculous, casting Ceausescu especially as a buffoonish contrarian engaged in opposition for opposition's sake. The purpose of this disinformation was to distract attention from the precise nature of that defiance and to discourage sympathy and support for it. In fact, ending Soviet military control was a central goal of Romanian policy since the early 1950s, motivating calls for the withdrawal of Soviet troops and advisors. During the Berlin and Cuban crisis, when Moscow bypassed national authorities and placed the Romanian army on alert, Bucharest reacted by ending the training of its officers in Soviet academies, shutting down Soviet influence and agent networks, and pledging to President Kennedy that Romania would not join a Soviet offensive against U.S. forces. Henceforth, Romania sought to block new assertions of Soviet control whenever they appeared within Europe and to roll back that control whenever possible, explaining to Chinese leaders, for example, in 1965, that although the armies of the other socialist countries were indeed subordinated to Soviet military command, their goal was to end that state of affairs, to ensure that no supranational control existed within the Warsaw Pact. As part of this effort, Bucharest maintained that neither the US nor NATO represented an offensive military threat in Europe that would justify the Kremlin's chain-ganging methods. In this lonely struggle, Romania often appeared the eternal optimist regarding international developments, bearing the brunt of coordinated attacks from the other pact members for its trouble. Virtually every attempt to strengthen integration because of what Moscow claimed to be an increasingly dangerous international environment was met by Romanian counter-argument that unilateral reductions in troop withdrawals, and especially the dissolution of the two military blocs, would reduce and remove those dangers. Even their mediation of third-party conflicts was motivated by this desire to rid Eastern Europe of Soviet control, allowing each state to be master in its own house. In the presence of crisis and tension, their prime minister explained to President Johnson in 1967, Moscow invariably tried to force them, quote, to get together, to renounce some of their sovereignty and some of their independence, and to obey the command of another state, endangering that which Romania has won and which they wish to preserve at all costs, end quote. The documents leave one with the impression of Soviet flight from the Romanians, not just the Parallel History Project documents. Secret talks to coordinate against Romanian positions, canceling meetings when Bucharest threatened to stymie Soviet purposes, suddenly dropping principal items from meeting agendas in the face of Romanian counterproposal, embargoing discussion of Romanian initiatives, and frequently stipulating that news of these differences be kept from a broader public. As Gomulka pronounced during one heated debate, quote, "It was not the six parties that were trying to put pressure on the Romanians. It was they who were putting pressure on the six parties." End quote. Prior to the 1966 summit, Romania made clear that the main flaw in the pact arose from regular violations of its basic principles, among others the principle of consultation, as demonstrated by the missile deployments to Cuba, Soviet arms proposals submitted to the UN, and the decision of the Unified Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief to move member armies to alert status on his own authority. Any wartime statute in '66, Bucharest insisted, must provide for collective decision-making and the eligibility of non-Soviet officers for the posts of Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Staff, two posts that should not belong to the same armies. The pact position that wartime command should rest with Soviet officers and institutions was rejected by Bucharest as irreconcilable with the sovereignty of member states, end quote. An internal discussion by the Hungarian Politburo laid out Moscow's dilemma. On the one hand, Romania refused to renounce positions that had subverted and impeded efforts to strengthen the Warsaw Pact. On the other hand, its departure from the pact was completely out of the question because of the larger context. Part of Bucharest's strategy entailed a more or less constant search for like-minded leaders in Eastern Europe. Its active efforts to build coalitions within the pact was an abiding concern of the Kremlin, and occasionally threatened catastrophe for Soviet strategy. As Gromyko noted during the Prague Spring, Czechoslovakia was rapidly becoming a second Romania, which at best would mean the complete collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Oh, missed one. According to the East German Stasi, Romania hoped and expected the developments in Czechoslovakia would radiate outwards to Hungary and Poland, where similar forces were also believed to be elaborating more independent national policies. Active measures, such as Hungarian efforts to persuade Prague that Romanian aid was treacherously given in order to, quote, find allies against the Soviet Union, against Comecon, and against the Warsaw Pact, end quote, became the order of the day. Clearly, Moscow had cause to worry about Romanian-Polish collusion. The documents show that, although unable to shift policy, the Polish General Staff shared Romania's perspective on the irreconcilable nature of Soviet control and national sovereignty. These documents, therefore, go a fair distance in explaining Moscow's drive to stigmatize the Romanians in such a manner as to discourage serious consideration of their policies. The image of Romanian inconsequence projected by the Kremlin, concealing genuine fears of contagion. The inter-pact relationships created by this dynamic were well reflected in the post-meeting meetings of the Ceausescu fan club, as, for example, 1971. Likewise, Romanian challenges to Soviet military preferences were underscored in meetings the Six held during the Helsinki process as well. At the 1978 summit, Romania rejected Soviet claims of a world hurtling towards war and of an arms race entirely provoked by the US and NATO. The world, according to Ceausescu, was actually becoming less dangerous. The West had not increased its military spending, and certainly not at the rate the Warsaw Pact had. The Soviet military grossly misrepresented the situation, and his country would not accept a subordination that contravened the provisions of the 1955 treaty. Back home in Bucharest, the Romanians described the statute as, quote, an emanation of Soviet militarist circles designed to draw the members into a dangerous arms race, transfer the command of their troops to the Soviet General Staff, undermine national sovereignty, and clear the path for Soviet interference in the domestic affairs of our states, end quote. Ceausescu now went public with Romanian objections, pointedly referring to NATO as a model of intra-alliance democratic procedure, and underscoring his country's, quote, traditionally friendly relations with many NATO states, which have always aided us in our struggle against foreign domination, thus giving Romanians no reason to regard them as a threat. Oh, it's not up there. While the CIA captured the dynamics of Soviet behavior rather well, US intelligence was less accurate in discerning the intent of non-Soviet Pact members, not surprisingly being a secondary consideration. US reliability assessments, although repeatedly footnoting Bucharest's rejection of Soviet command authority and of an offensive strategy, typically concluded that Romania would participate in a Soviet-led offensive nonetheless, even when acknowledging the difficulty in identifying such a role, given that Romania balked at any participation in offensive operations whatsoever. Assessments that General Jaruzelski was resisting Soviet demands appear similarly questionable. According to Colonel Kuklinski, Jaruzelski dismissed Romanian offers of support for any independent Polish stance within the pact as counter-revolutionary plot. Instead, he joined anti-Romanian countermeasures and even went so far as to willfully misrepresent Romanian positions to higher political authority in Warsaw. In 1980, Romania circulated a line-by-line revision of the statute that would have transformed the pact into a genuinely coalitional alliance in wartime, while redoubling efforts to render the statute superfluous. To Soviet military claims of reinforced aggressive preparations by NATO, and especially by the US and West Germany, Ceausescu responded that the other NATO states had not fulfilled their projected increases, that economic priorities superseded military ones, and that, quote, if we do not raise living standards, then even missiles will do us no good. Unlike the other members, Bucharest had not portrayed the US, NATO, or West Germany as enemies in its domestic propaganda since the 1960s. Now, it actively combated the enemy imaging of the West within Warsaw Pact councils as well, using its leverage to exclude demonizing references to the US in particular, while insisting that the blame for global tensions be equally shared. This stance denied the justifying threat behind Soviet efforts to enforce tighter integration and subordination. By stressing the shared responsibility of the Warsaw Pact members for creating tensions, it also established the logical basis for unilateral freezes, reductions, and withdrawals as effective means for easing tensions, transitioning to disarmament and ending the Cold War. In effect, Romania hijacked the tactics and messages directed against the West by Soviet-controlled peace fronts and turned them inward. The contrast in Romanian and Soviet aims was often explicit, with Bucharest seeking to dissolve the pact and transcend East-West confrontation, while Moscow sought to man up the alliance in order to win the Cold War. This contrast was perhaps most evident during Andropov's attempts to play up fears of a U.S. nuclear first strike, regardless of how genuine that might have been. The Soviet leader insisted upon the absolute necessity of military countermeasures, dismissing any possibility of even discussing the unilateral disbandment of the Warsaw Pact, only to have Ceausescu riposte that the balance of nuclear forces had to be reduced to a lower level, that unilateral reductions and withdrawals were the key to removing the threat, and that concrete actions were immediately necessary to reduce the military character of the alliances and limit their activity as prelude to dissolution. Behind the scenes, Bucharest was being even more troublesome, advocating Reagan's zero option and actually encouraging the Czechoslovaks and East Germans to resist the deployment of Soviet weapons. During the first quarter of 1985, Romania refused to even discuss an extension of the Warsaw Pact unless members considered its proposals for meeting with NATO on arms reductions, jointly preparing Soviet-US disarmament negotiations, adopting a unilateral budget freeze, and reorganizing the Political Consultative Committee. Moscow's new push for formalizing the Wartime Statute in 1988 was interpreted by Ceausescu as a reassertion of Soviet control, quote, until we do away with nuclear weapons and the military blocs, end quote. In response, Romania proposed that the PCC be broken out of the Warsaw Pact altogether and transformed into an organization dealing with socio-economic issues primarily, to include Yugoslavia and Albania. It further proposed that the pact shift into a secondary role and be made more democratic, with more frequent rotation of its leadership among all rather than just the Soviet members. In contrast to Kremlin aims of reinforcing the alliance and Soviet control over it, Bucharest proposals were made on the basis of new opportunities for disarmament, the easing of tensions and cooperation in Europe, and the dissolution of NATO and the Warsaw Pact as quickly as possible. According to Moscow, Romania's obvious intention was to dismantle the pact, separating political from military functions, imposing collective decision-making in both peace and war, and rotating the leadership to non-Soviet members, all with the aim of weakening the now existing system of the alliance's military organization. Hungarian authorities concurred, noting that in their push to dismantle the pact and block supranational Soviet control, the Romanians, quote, clearly placed the Soviet leadership under great pressure, forcing it to concede over the issue of Warsaw Pact modernization. The declaration of the July 1989 summit in Bucharest reflected in almost every detail Romanian positions persistently advocated since the founding of the Warsaw Pact. Ironically, Romania was pulling off its Van Helsing, finally driving a stake through the heart of this instrument of Soviet control in the midst of a massive disinformation campaign, depicting it as seeking to obtain nuclear weapons, as advocating interventions against its own allies, as engaging in genocide, and as being a Soviet Trojan horse. Much of this disinformation was plausible because the regime in Bucharest held two mutually exclusive sets of norms and values for foreign and domestic policies. The former sought to transcend the status of object in international politics and owed its inspiration to classically liberal international legal theory. The latter, based on a socialism that countenanced no sharing of power by the dictatorship and no form of property ownership outside the party state, blocked any hope of liberalizing democratic or economic reforms. Indeed, Ceausescu's irrational domestic regime lent credibility to even the most extravagant anti-Romanian disinformation. In conclusion, this collection allows one of the clearest perspectives yet on the tenaciousness of Romania's battle against Soviet hegemony within the Warsaw Pact. Debunking assessments that the country and its leadership had somehow been brought or bought back into the line during the 1980s, these documents suggest that closer examination of Romanian defiance during the last decade of the Cold War will yield further revelations still. Thank you.
Larry, thank you very much. Number of points there we'll be able to debate and discuss, I'm sure, when we come to the comments and questions. Now let me turn to General Yaiko.
Well, I've written out my remarks, so you can hold me responsible for them. The Central Intelligence Agency, I think, is to be complimented on the very good job that they have done in declassifying and releasing so many of the essential documents concerning the Warsaw Pact. It has to be noted that so many of these documents are available only because of the immense bravery and moral sensibility of the late Ryszard Kuklinski, a Polish army colonel on the general staff, who passed them on at mortal risk to himself and his family. Colonel Kuklinski was a great Polish patriot and is an insufficiently known hero. Doctors Byrne and Masna are to be congratulated on their book, A Cardboard Castle, an incomparable and voluminous compilation of documentation covering the entire history of the Warsaw Pact. The book is obviously a singular source for and service to scholars. I'm going to make some very general comments and express some very personal views concerning the Warsaw Pact based on the documents about which we've been invited to speak. But for those reading the documents and those who had practical experience of the Soviet so-called alliance, observations based on the documents are obvious and confirmatory of what was known or suspected. Nevertheless, there are some revelations that provide unpleasant confirmation about the extremes of Soviet behavior towards the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact member states. The thread of Soviet boorishness, brutality, insult, and denigration of the Eastern European states is unbroken throughout the history of the Warsaw Pact. On the other side, not in any way comparable to Soviet behavior, the United States and some European members of the North Atlantic Treaty sometimes exhibited a patronizing or dismissive attitude towards some of the European members of the Warsaw Pact in NATO-Warsaw Pact relations. And some of this is recorded in our diplomacy. The West often assumed that the Eastern Europeans had no views of their own, or that the views were merely slight differences from the Soviets' positions. The United States and NATO rather consistently preferred to deal only with the Soviets. And parenthetically, I well remember when I was an analyst and Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence at Headquarters United States Air Force, how intelligence officers consistently pronounced the abbreviation NSWP as nose wipe. Occasionally in the presence of representatives of those nations. Of course, this demeaning characterization did nothing to endear the United States to the so-called nose wipe countries. My repeated objections to my fellow intelligence officers fell on deaf ears, of course. And neither the Soviet Union nor the United States at times seemed to take the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members seriously. The very first sentence of the Warsaw Treaty belies what was intended by the Soviets and what the alliance became. The opening sentence states that the Warsaw Pact is based on mutual non-interference in the internal affairs of its members and respect for their national sovereignty and political independence. The whole history of the Warsaw Pact shows that this was a sham. The Soviets never honored these declarations and never intended to do so. The basis for the Warsaw Pact was, in fact, already in existence in the bilateral treaties between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the several Eastern European states, and founded on the forced party, political, and military relationships that were established during World War II and the subsequent post-war permanent military occupations. In fact, the Warsaw Treaty was a cover for the Soviets' complete control of the armed forces of the several Eastern European states, excepting, of course, Yugoslavia and later Albania and Romania. The Warsaw Pact was also a handy, but not too believable facade for Soviet propaganda, convincing, I think, only to that numerous and ubiquitous class of useful idiots. The Warsaw Pact did successfully serve its primary purpose, namely Soviet political and military control of the conquered Eastern European states and Soviet enforcement of the tolerable limits of Eastern European ideological deviations. The Soviet war with Hungary, or on Hungary in 1956, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia with the forced, despicable participation of its neighbors in 1968, and the Soviets' reluctant threat of invasion of Poland in 1981 were stark, crude, and bloody lessons that there was no escape from Soviet mastery. These lessons were well learned by the puppet parties, governments, and military commands, and the oppressed peoples of occupied Eastern Europe. The depth of subordination of the East Europeans to their Soviet superiors was demeaningly evident already in 1955, when it was decreed that the Supreme Commander and the two theater commanders of the new Warsaw Pact, who were and would always be Russian, would in wartime unilaterally determine the number of troops required from each of the Eastern European member states without any opportunity for objection or demurral or even agreement by those states. The force structure, equipage, and training of these troops were prescribed by the Soviets in advance in peacetime. The employment of the Eastern European troops in wartime was determined solely by the Soviets without any consideration to issues that were of great importance to those nations. The Supreme High Command of the Warsaw Pact Armed Forces was in fact, and without any disguise, the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces. The two Soviet theater commanders were invested with absolute authority in directing actions of subordinate units and were authorized direct contact with the political military leaderships of the Allied countries on all matters. Additionally, the theater chiefs of staff, who were Russian, of course, would oversee the general staffs of the member states and would designate the Eastern European flag general officers to wartime commands in their own national armed forces. To ensure the Eastern Europeans' obedience to Soviet wartime orders, the theater commanders would second Soviet operational groups to each of the national forces. Importantly, the Eastern European members of the Warsaw Pact had no say in wartime combat operations, including planning, missions, tasks, objectives, and of course command. In short, the Eastern Europeans were simply to furnish and expend their blood and treasure for a Soviet cause based on a Soviet decision in which they had no say. Any pretense even of a genuine combined alliance structure was absent. Parenthetically, the Poles in particular were bitterly unhappy at and resentful of the loss of the national character of their armed forces. After all, it was the Polish army that embodied the nation. And although it was called the Warsaw Pact and not the Moscow Pact, there never was any Eastern European officer in any command position of importance. So there was not even a pretense of sovereignty. There were also other differences between the Eastern European states and the Soviet Union, and also among the Eastern European Pact members. I remember an amusing incident after one of the Pact exercises in the 70s, when those inveterate overachievers, the East German generals, held their own critique of the exercise, separate from the Soviets, during which a few of them boasted that of all the national forces in the Pact, only they could fight their way to the Atlantic and then turn around, defeat the Russians, and drive to Moscow. The history of the Warsaw
German
Pact,
modesty.
the history of the Warsaw Pact is also the history of the Eastern Europeans' continuous, but often muted, weak, and ineffective resistance and objection to the terms of subordination as demonstrated by the repeated but almost always unsuccessful attempts at reform of the organization of the Pact and their own responsibilities in it. Witness Polish General Drzewiecki's 1956 proposal, General Duszyński's proposal, the Hungarian proposals of 1966, the Romanian proposal of 1988, and lastly, towards the end, the Bulgarian proposal of 1989. Repeated Eastern European complaints and suggestions to establish something approaching an alliance of equals that would have autonomous institutions with authority and responsibility accountable to all members were denied summarily by the Soviets. All of the disagreements, complaints, and proposals were clear indications of the dissatisfaction and disillusionment of the Eastern Europeans with the Soviets over fundamental alliance issues. They also had to be indicators to the Soviets of a long-standing They also had to be indicators to the Soviets of a long-standing, even hostile dislike in some cases that suggested the tenuous reliability and loyalty of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact allies. The Soviets could not have had any doubt that the Warsaw Pact sat precariously on Soviet bayonets. Notwithstanding this record of disagreement between the Soviets and the other member states of the Warsaw Pact, the United States never took any significant action in economics, diplomacy, or informational activities to take advantage of the differences and exacerbate them. They were exploitable opportunities. I remember my own experience when the Poles approached the United States and explained some significant differences with the Soviets concerning the issues in those interminable, mind-numbing, mutual and balanced force reductions talks in the 70s. The United States ignored the Polish initiatives, and the intelligence community glossed over them. Yet disarmament between the Warsaw Pact and the United States was a subject of continuous concern to the several Eastern European members of the Pact besides Poland. The United States may have identified vulnerabilities in the Warsaw Pact's cohesion, but it certainly took no measures to exploit them. I think that the American indifference to the divergences between the Soviet Union and the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members reinforced and buttressed the bloc as a bloc and enhanced its legitimacy. But of course, this kind of non-action by the United States had occurred all too commonly because the United States tended to view Eastern Europe through Russian lenses from Moscow's perspective. Morally, this policy resembled the British Prime Minister's unfortunate characterization immediately after deplaning on his return from the infamous Munich conference. An indication of how little the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact countries apparently played into the United States' concerns over war with the Soviet Union is that only two, as far as I know, national intelligence estimates about them were produced in 1966 and 1983. Yet, in between those dates, serious arms control negotiations were conducted between the United States and the USSR, and several significant events occurred that shook the bloc's stability and consequently its reliability. The Warsaw Pact's wartime and mobilization system imposed by the Soviets provided for the transmission, according to the documents, within 2 minutes of the order to go to war. Now, war is the most important and consequential decision any state makes. In the past, it was called ultima ratio regni. That message went from the Soviet General Staff directly to the Eastern European national forces, bypassing all Eastern European party, political, and military leaders without any notification to, consultation with, or approval by them. The Soviets' sole control of the decision to go to war was proof of the abrogation of even the last shred of the Eastern European sovereignties. There can be no better proof of the disdainful disregard by the Soviets of their allies' most important national interests. Even concerning this fundamental right affecting the possible survival of a sovereign state, the Soviets, as was their wont, began their long preparation of this deprivation with the Zapad 77 exercise. Soviet Marshal Kulikov set the tone and made clear the intent with his vulgar, insulting, and bullying behavior towards Polish generals Jaruzelski and Siwicki, and his deliberate disdain for Gierek, the Polish Communist Party leader. Obviously, the Eastern European military leaders were expected to be no more than messenger boys. Although the political utility of the Warsaw Pact vis-a-vis the United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was sometimes in doubt, not least among the Soviets seemed to be confident that their Warsaw Pact allies would comply if it came to war.
The pact structure and procedures seem to assure that. Moreover, the active, even enthusiastic participation of the pact allies was crucial to a Soviet-led war against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These allies, after all, were an integral component of the combat forces in the war plan 7 Days to the Rhine, which was tested and refined in all the Pact's exercises beginning in 1979. In fact, the Soviets planned to reach the English Channel within 14 days in a massive combined offensive defeating NATO forces. The Soviets' objective and expectation were the rapid defeat of NATO before the NATO political military structure could respond, sort of maximizing the OODA loop on the grandest scale. The Soviets planned on serial operational victories, knocking NATO countries out of effective combat, breaking the will of the NATO countries, and rendering NATO non-existent. This rapid advance would prevent the United States from escalating to the use of nuclear weapons, would render irrelevant United States force generation and mobilization, and thus preempt the longer war of attrition in which the United States could bring to bear its longer-range assets. Moreover, the Soviet war plan was predicated on the assumption that only a short war would ensure the reliability of their pact allies. If it had come to a NATO Warsaw Pact war, I think it would have been the group of Soviet forces, Germany, and probably the East Germans, who likely alone would have attacked with enthusiasm and initiative. The Soviet war plan has to be balanced against the United States plan, which would target Soviet second echelon forces, the follow-on forces attack in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary with tactical nuclear weapons. Obviously, if it came to this, any American hope for the East European forces' defection or even resistance to the Soviets would be highly unlikely. Both the Soviet and American war plans were based on tenuous assumptions and fanciful expectations of maintaining control of escalation. These plans and their results were highly problematical. Thankfully, NATO and the Warsaw Pact never went to war. Even with the revelation of so many official documents concerning the Warsaw Pact, not all of the important historical issues concerning the pact have been elucidated and settled. A score of years after the demise of the Warsaw Pact and its leader, the Soviet Union, there is still no comprehensive investigation of a fundamental issue that continues to befuddle statesmen and strategists and will probably be a fundamental issue in some future confrontations and conflicts, namely the big question of deterrence. Although there are many studies of deterrence, none is completely satisfactory, and there seems to be no universal application. Are there relevant lessons for the future from this long East-West confrontation? Can deterrence, as in this historical case, be composed of several constituents? What value can be put on individual components of a deterrent in ensuring the desired result? If the Soviets indeed had the intent to go to war with NATO, what deterred them? Was it the fear of a homeland-to-homeland exchange of nuclear weapons? Was it the American tactical nuclear weapons on NATO's European soil? Was it the technological superiority of American conventional weapons? Was it some combination of these weapons and their associated doctrines and targeting? Was it some other technological or some economic factors? Was it a lack of faith in the certainty of the triumph of socialism? Was deterrence simply a matter of perceptions, uncertainty, incalculability, and fear? Or is this issue irrelevant, at least for that specific historical confrontation? Perhaps the Soviets simply suffered from the inertia of peace. Yet despite all the Soviets' political and military measures, beginning with 1956, the Soviets must have had their doubts about their allies, particularly in a pinch. The revolts of 1956, of course, 1968, and 1981 could only have deepened their doubts. 1956 was a frightening reminder to the Eastern Europeans as to who was in charge and the cost of rebellion. At the same time, it was the beginning of that profound cynicism of the peoples engendered by their servile status that began the slow rot that finally resulted in the swift collapse of the pact. The Soviets had some share in undermining the stability, legitimacy, loyalty, and ultimately the integrity and reliability of the Warsaw Pact. I think the process began with Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin, which by implication discredited the USSR itself and the Warsaw Pact. Thus, beginning in the 1970s, the Soviets' own diplomacy in pursuit of lessening East-West tensions lessened the seeming need for the pact and thereby lessened the reliability of its European members. So in my view, the primary purpose of the Warsaw Pact was not as an alliance to fight a war against the United States and its NATO allies. Rather, the pact certainly over time became an instrument for controlling and retaining the Soviets' conquest of Eastern Europe. This mission of territorial retention was second only to the Eastern European National Armed Forces, was second only to the defense of Mother Russia. The direct links from the Soviet General Staff to the Eastern European National Armed Forces served to ensure the permanence of this territorial conquest. The history of the Soviet occupation demonstrates, I think, the continuity of this interest. The 1949 bilateral treaties with the Eastern European states granted the Soviets the rights to the military occupation of those Eastern European states. The multilateral 1955 Warsaw Treaty institutionalized the Soviet presence in this half of Europe. Even before the formation of the Warsaw Pact, and certainly after each of the several subsequent East European rebellions, the Soviet presence was preserved and, of course, strengthened, but certainly not legitimated by the introduction of Soviet army divisions and their organization and permanent commands. The Northern Group of Soviet Forces in 1947, the Group of Soviet Forces in Germany in 1949, the establishment of the Central Group of Soviet Forces in 1956, and the doubling of the Southern Group of Soviet Forces in 1957, together totaling some 30 divisions plus massive support forces. The entire history of the Warsaw Pact military exercises, both field and command post, in my opinion, illustrates my point as to the Soviets' retention of these states. The Soviets permitted no independent planning, training, equipage, readiness, mobilization, or control by the national forces. In fact, the Soviets prevented initiatives in these essential activities from the Eastern European states, which could have improved the training, planning, and morale of the Eastern European National Armed Forces to the Soviet Armed Forces' advantage. The exercises absolutely reduced the possibilities of the East Europeans' resistance to Soviet domination. The Soviets' pursuit since the late 1960s of East-West agreements legally securing the political and territorial accretions of World War II in Eastern Europe, Stalin's annexations following World War II, underlines the primary Soviet interest. Clearly, the Soviets intended to remain in Eastern Europe in perpetuum. Yet, at the end of this long, sad history of institutionalized terror, incompetent governance, impoverishment, militarization, persecution of civilization and religion, the West, in denial of all that it stood for and strove for, was not only not prepared to welcome liberation, but actively opposed it. When the Warsaw Pact was dissolving, astonishingly, the United States and some of its NATO allies, in a lapse of strategy and morality, were dismayed at the withdrawal of Soviet Russia from the continent and were more concerned with the stasis and stability that Russia purportedly provided in that half of Europe. The end of the Warsaw Pact was then both joyous and shameful. In a longer view of European history, the Warsaw Pact was unquestionably the prison of nations that sequestered the Eastern European nations from their common European heritage with the intent of de-Westernizing them. The Pact's dismal, demoralizing history is a brutal record of how effective it was in tormenting, twisting, and trying to kill the souls of its members. It was an evil institution like its sponsor that was meant to attack and to eradicate the unique dignity and worth of man and 2 millennia-long patrimony of Western civilization, especially its ideals, principles, and values. When the Warsaw Pact was finally dismantled after the collapse of Soviet control in East Europe, its demise was decades overdue.
Thank you very much, and thank you for also putting on the agenda one of the policy issues that Christian referred to at the outset, the issue of were there exploitable vulnerabilities. We'll turn now to Fritz.
Thanks, Ross. I am probably the least qualified speaker on the topic before us that you'll hear from today. And for that reason, I actually tried to decline the invitation. I was never a producer analyst of intelligence product exploiting the materials before us. I was rather something of a consumer, or perhaps more honestly, repackager of stuff produced by guys like McKecken and Pappas and others. You know, that's what NIOs and Nick Chairman and people like that do. And I spent no time after the end of my retirement, end of the Cold War, on this topic, although I, knew some really interesting stuff was coming out, and I had very little time for looking at the material directly before us as a result of the most recent declassifications. So I arrived here not knowing what I could contribute, but after a little bit of time, I figured it out. I do have a perspective that allows a few comments on context that I think should be valuable. One of them has to do with a mission, an intelligence mission, a national security mission that's gotten some allusion to here, but deserves more. And it's probably the context in which the intelligence transmitted and contained in the documents before us that we got in real time from heroes like Kuklinski was most important, and that is keeping the Cold War cold, the indications and warning business. I mean, we can lament until the cows come home about the dictatorial nature of the Warsaw Pact and the evil nature of the Soviet Empire. It's a tiresome topic, but one that deserves occasional re-illumination because it raises the kind of issues that Walt, raised. Did we do right by our own values, in dealing with our adversary counterparts across the dividing line of the Cold War in Europe? But keeping the Cold War cold was pretty damn important. And the strategic value in the indications and warning business of the materials that you're now consulting was that in the context of all the other stuff, order of battle, TO&E, doctrinal insights, what we knew about exercises, and other kinds of contributions from agents, penetration agents like Kuklinski, and especially SIGINT for indications and warning. We had the system pretty well wired. We had their cookbooks. We knew how they had to go to war by their own rules and the logic of what they would want to try to achieve. And knowing the cookbook gave us confidence that we could provide warning in the event the gong was rung or the balloon went up. And equally important, say on any given day, no, Mr. President, the war is not starting, despite the alarms you may be hearing going off in various quarters for one reason or another. And as some people in the room know, the most important, dramatic, edifying test of this was the so-called war scare episode of the 82, 83, just a little bit into 84 period. We have some veterans of that. You know, I was a real beneficiary of the kind of insights that came to us via the sort of materials that we're looking at here on this matter. I had spent a couple of years, by the way, I was in the Carter administration as well in the NSC to lend a bipartisan flavor to my bio, faint though that might be. I was out in the private sector working for Northrop for a couple of years, although I was retained a consultantship with the agency and access to you know, a lot of the materials and some knowledge of what we were getting. Gates brought me back in as an NIO in January '84, and the first job I got was to do an NIE on this war scare, a bunch of disturbing, to some somewhat frightening oddities in Soviet and Pact military activities, including such things as, well, you know, the Soviets didn't send their military trucks to, you know, participate in the annual harvest. They must be getting ready for something. There were a bunch of such things going on, including some episodes at sea. And Gates commissioned me and, you know, the relevant pieces of the community to do an NIE on all this. I can't even remember what the title was. It was typically and stupidly arcane. Implications of peculiar Soviet military activities or something like that. It's been almost entirely declassified, by the way, except for a few passages blacked out. And I can't even remember why they were blacked out, but they probably had to do with, you know, some sensitive humor. You know, I sat down with the community's experts to work the problem. And by the way, that community was worldwide. I mean, we had electronic inputs from all around, from the commands, of course, in NATO, also from the Pacific. And after a separation from, you know, the kind of contact that I'd had as a staffer in OSR, as an NIO, and even as a staffer down at the NSC, separated by some years from the flow of stuff, of traffic and analysis relevant to INW, I was really pleased to find how good we'd become, thanks to guys like Kuklinski and our ability to wed that reporting to what we were getting through other channels, you know, real good all-source analysis for warning purposes. Now, by the time I was charged with doing this NIE, Gates and the rest of the NFIB wanted to say, what's been going on here? But the danger had already passed, so we were kind of doing it for the record. I mean, on January 4th, 1984, Reagan gave a détente kind of speech with his actor's sense of timing. He knew when it was right to change the tone. Chernenko followed up with a kind of détente speech a few weeks later, and the atmosphere in U.S.-Soviet relations, East-West relations, changed pretty dramatically and kept doing so. But we did this NIE anyway. It came out in May. The INW role, however, of the materials that we had, the insight we had, the all-source intelligence and appreciation that we had from all these different sources through all these different authorities around the community, you know, that value had already been expressed, had already been recorded in a way by these entities being able to say on any given day to their chain of command, no, the war isn't coming. The question we tabled was, do these anomalous activities bespeak a preparation for imminent hostilities on the part of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact? Because either A, they believe the Reagan administration, which they fulminate so much about, is going to start something dangerous and they have to be ready for it, or B, to whack the Reagan administration they fulminate so much about, they're going to start something dangerous and they have to be ready for it. Well, to make a long story short, our bottom line was no. The anomalies are anomalies, or they're not really anomalies. They fit a plan of testing, of experimentation, of exercising. They're just novelties. We just haven't seen them before. Or you know, it's noise. They are not preparing for war. To my knowledge, the most dramatic event in that whole panoply of activities was the response to Able Archer, the command post exercise, nuclear release exercise that took place periodically in NATO. And you know, one of the events was, the Russians watched it, or the Soviets watched it meticulously with SIGINT and agent sources, you know, every year. In this case, in '83, we detected the alert of a tactical strike, airstrike regiment in East Germany that was nuclear capable. To this day, I don't know whether it's ever been run to ground, whether that detection was spurious or just anomalous. We weren't able to settle the problem when we did this NIE because, you know, we didn't have the time and the resources to go and backtrack everything, do a CSI on this. But interestingly, years later, when, oh gosh, the journalist historian, can't remember, not Hoffman. No, it wasn't Ben. It was a journalist. Anyway. No, you know,
Journalist.
my memory. Anyway, he interviewed Akhromeyev, and you know, who was the chief of the ops directorate of the Soviet General Staff, and he asked, well, what about Able Archer, '83? And Akhromeyev scratched it, Able Archer. I can't remind me what was Able Archer. Doug Gartov, Ray Gartov came up with similar blanks on the Soviet side. You know, we got it right in a period when having got it wrong on the more alarmist side could have been really, really dangerous. And part of the reason we got it right is because we had good, recent, even real-time appreciation of how the Soviet Warsaw Pact system worked, kind of mechanically, what it had to do. And, you know, I take a certain amount of pride in that little drill, and was therefore quite disgusted when a British documentary company called Flashback, is Ben still around?
No, he left.
Did a recap of the war scare in which I swear they fabricated some footage of you know, Soviet generals in a bunker, you know, preparing for war, and they conned Bob Gates into remarking this was the most dangerous period since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm a great admirer of Bob Gates, but you know, I do have some problems with some of his analysis over the years. So, you know, that's a context. that's a context. I had the pleasure of meeting Kuklinski at the 10th anniversary of the end of the Cold War down at Texas A&M in '99, and had a nice conversation with him about this, and you know, remarked to him how he ought to appreciate that he wasn't just putting good stuff in our files. He was helping to keep the peace. And then I had occasion to, right after that conversation, to give a little interview to Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal, who was down there covering the conference, to this effect. He ran a story the next day in the Wall Street Journal. And the next morning around 5 a.m., my dog started barking. I heard a funny noise at the front door. You know, I got myself out of bed, put a bathrobe on, got down there, you know, opened the front door, and there was a manila envelope between the screen and the front door in which there was this copy of this marvelous photograph of the youthful Jaruzelski handing documents to, who was it, Jakubowski or, you know. Yes, Kuklinski doing the, you know, handing documents. Ustinov and Akhramev, yeah. I concluded from the speed at which that occurred that Kuklinski was resident in the Northern Virginia area. A mind like a steel trap. Spring's a little weak lately. All right, that's one context. Another context, I want to keep this short, but it's important to table. There are probably a bunch of people at this table who can comment on this and add some, you know, some sinew to this context. And that would include Eris. And it has to do with the viability from a military technical point of view of Soviet thinking about war in Europe. Remember the period we're talking about here. You know, I'm really cold on the earlier period. You know, my professional life was really centered on that phase, a very important phase between kind of the early mid-'70s and the mid-'80s. It was a transition phase. It was a transition, and you know, for Soviet power. Early in that phase, in that decade, you can say it was a period of Soviet strategic confidence. They had accomplished an enormous buildup of their strategic nuclear forces, their theater nuclear forces, impressive modernization of their general purpose forces, the building of at least some, you know, elements of a blue water navy, and were, you know, into outreach into the third world. We were grappling with, you know, how to appreciate the ambition, the degree of ambition of Soviet strategic objectives, and that's when the A-Team, B-Team exercise kind of got started, in which I was a participant. And, you know, this was a period in which the U.S. had troubles. You know, we had Watergate, we had economic difficulties. We, you know, we got, you know, rolled out of Vietnam, which was certainly chalked up by the Soviet Union as a historic strategic loss. You know, that was a period in which, you know, Soviet ideological pronouncements would talk about historic tendencies in the strategic correlation of forces are favorable. And, you know, I wrote an NIE. Arnold Horlick was the NIO. I was a consultant. I drafted this thing. 11/4/1978, when it came out. Again, a soporific title. I can't remember what it was, but it was about basically how are the Soviets thinking about cashing in on their newfound strategic power. That was the atmosphere in the late, late 70s. But as folks began to notice, especially at CIA and the guys looking at the Soviet military budget, things weren't working out too well. The shoe was beginning to pinch economically. Rapidly, the misadventure in Afghanistan began to display itself for what it really was. But what I want to table here is an aspect of this that I think is important when you're looking at this stream of intelligence coming at us and now revealed in these documents. Look for traces of this. One of the themes of Soviet strategic confidence in the early to mid-70s was that they would take advantage of what they termed a revolution in military affairs, by which the technologies of jet and rocket propulsion, allowing rapid, accurate strikes deep, from front line deep into enemy territory, combined with modern microelectronics for sensing, tabulating, understanding, and communicating, would all come together to permit a much more intelligent form of combined arms land combat warfare. And they had a sort of an operational concept for accomplishing that called the reconnaissance strike complex. It combined reconnaissance, air power, missile power, artillery power to do this punching through of the adversary's defenses and accomplish the 7 days to the Atlantic. Well, the inventive Yankees kind of took this up as well in a number of ways, but the one I know most closely because of friends and participation was the concept of air-land battle, adopted by the U.S. Army in the 76, 77 time frame. And we started doing it. And in due course, the nuclear systems, Pershing and Glickman, kind of folded into this picture. And we confronted the Soviets with a disturbing and demoralizing reality, which was, hey, we invented this stuff, and the Americans are doing it, and we can't do it because of technological backwardness. Despite the wizardry of our engineers and scientists, our military-industrial complex can't or won't produce this stuff. Now, I guarantee you that this complaint was part of a stream of messages going from the Soviet military to the political leadership that eventually brought Gorbachev to power. SDI was a factor in that, but I think that the recognition that because of Western economic and technological superiority and Soviet inferiority, that the U.S. NATO were going to take advantage of the revolution in military affairs, had a real significant impact on at least the elements of the Soviet elite that were willing to consider modernization strategies that brought Gorbachev to power. Now, the cockpit of all this was in the Central European theater, and therefore traces of the concern have to show up in the materials that we're looking at here. My scrutiny of them has been too cursory to get more than a flavor of, there's a lot of cant in these documents. I mean, it's hard to imagine the mentality of the people who kind of composed this stuff. But you do see reflections. Oh, we must improve readiness. We must improve interconnectivity of, electronic warfare support and so forth and so on. But the fact is, the Soviets fell behind in this, a race the importance of which they may in a way have recognized more than we did. And it played a very significant role in the political transformation in the Soviet Union that led eventually, well, you know, the first decision is we got to reform ourselves substantially if we're going to compete. That produced Gorbachev and Perestroika. But very quickly it says, we're still not going to be able to compete. We got to get out of this game, which produced the defensive strategy, and you know, the rest is history. And I think it's worth looking at the documents that have just been open to scrutiny for traces of this I think, very historic and underappreciated transformation. The struggle of the Soviets to make, it wasn't just over control, it was strategic power on the western end of Eurasia. The struggle of the Soviets to translate control into a historic, history-transforming kind of superiority was a very, very important part of this history. Their recognition that they were failing was an important part of how it turned out.
Very good. Fritz, thank you very much. Thanks to all three of our panelists. We have up to a half hour now. We can have discussion, questions, comment, objections. And at the end of our last part of our workshop here, everyone is invited outside here in the foyer to a reception, bit to eat and drink when we finish. But first, we've got some work to do, so the floor is open for, let me call first on Mark Kramer.
Let me ask Larry, you mentioned, Larry, in talking about Romania and its maverick role within the Warsaw Pact. You said that complete departure from the Warsaw Pact was out of the question because of the larger strategic context. But I'm wondering, why, I'm still not clear about that. I mean, Albania had left without any significant difficulty. There was some Soviet pressure in the early 60s to rein in Albania. But when Albania left in 68 formally, there was essentially it was just a footnote. And given Ceausescu's defiance, why didn't he? That is, it's often thought of that the Warsaw Pact was like the song Hotel California, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. But in fact, Albania had left, and that made it very different, even from, in NATO, France and Greece left the integrated military commands at times, but they never actually left the alliance. The Warsaw Pact was different in that it did have a member that had left. So why in Romania was it out of the question?
Larry, let me append to Mark's question another question, which is for you. You allude, or you mentioned there briefly at the conclusion, Ceausescu's problem in terms of international activity created by his domestic repression. And I remind us that was exactly the period when not only did you have this very repressive internal system, but Ceausescu alone was going after his opponents around Europe with violence. Not exactly how you win friends and influence people. So can you?
Depends on your outlook.
So maybe you can say a little more about, did it ever occur to this Romanian regime that they might get further internationally with a little different approach at home?
Okay. The comment about the larger context about Romania, the being out of question departure of Romania because of the larger context, comes from a meeting of the Hungarian Politburo, Kadar and Smirnai, several of the others, Dezo Remes. The main aspect we're used to, in fact, this panel is about, we're used to looking at this, the military aspect of this, and so therefore it's the full gap, and therefore it's only the northern tier, all of which are perfectly correct. The Soviets looked at this issue as a issue of keeping the Eastern Europe together and under its thumb. When it looked to the Balkans, it saw that in the beginning of 1948, in January, there was a lot of red down there. In 1958, Yugoslavia was gone. Albania was already halfway out the door. In 1968, Albania was gone. Yugoslavia is gone. Romania is almost gone, if it wants, apparently, somehow. Things are very unclear in this direction still. It was whittling away down there. It was very difficult. Romania was actually pushing this Balkan Pact idea that was going to transgress both of the alliances, and it was with Greece and Turkey, 2 NATO members. Luckily, Bulgaria was running shotgun for the Soviets and making sure nothing came of it. But the larger context, there are several aspects to it. The main one is that they would lose Bulgaria if they lost Romania. Not right away. They would spend a lot of money keeping it. Maybe 10 years, maybe as long as Albania stayed in formally at least. But if Romania left, because in the Soviet thinking and from what's reflected from the documents that exist from the other Warsaw Pact members, it wasn't that Romania was going to, and especially from '89 from the Bogomolov reports and some others, it wasn't that just Romania was going to leave and then go nowhere. The fear was always it was going to realign with the West. If it realigned with the West, there was a pure competition between Romania and Yugoslavia already for relationships with the United States. So Yugoslavia was going to get even closer to the West, and then you have Greece and Turkey, 2 NATO countries bordering Bulgaria, and this realignment with the West was going to bring with it economic support from the West as well, a reintegration of the world economy, better living standards. So Bulgaria resisting this over the long term, highly doubtful. More than that, the attraction for, first of all, the Romanian population in Moldova and also in the Ukraine, which, as you noted, really became an issue for them in 1968, when all of a sudden these ethnic Romanian Moldovans, actually I don't know how we're describing them these days, but back then we were describing them as ethnic Romanians, were sort of reasserting that identity, calling for the Latin alphabet back, et cetera. Beyond that, if there was an actual living standard improvement over there, instead of using Transylvania as a lever over Romania, it would become a lever over Hungary. Not only Hungary, but also Czechoslovakia, especially the Hungarian regions in Slovakia. And beyond, and of course, the major threat, the primary one running through all the Stasi documents especially, was of infection for this nationalist independent behavior. Czechoslovakia most obviously, but the Romanians were always banking on Hungary and Poland. But also the Baltic states. So from the perspective of larger context, there really was a problem with Romania leaving, not to do with military confrontation, but to do with the ability to hang on to Eastern Europe. No. There was no reconsideration domestically, and it's interesting what occurred there. Up until the mid-70s, there was a group of strategic minds in Romania that led to all the breakthroughs ever since Gheorghe Dej. And it included, Ceausescu was part of the group, but not because of his strategic mind, although he did have a natural talent for mediation, which is odd. I never saw whenever I saw him, it was a public appearance and he was reading, and there was nothing of any sort of this skill. But when you see what for instance, the Israeli ambassadors were writing about his ability to walk into a meeting, no papers, put everyone at ease, and then talk about everything and remember all the points. I never saw that, ever, publicly. So there's, in a sense, the regime, both the regime and possibly the leader were bipolar. There's something here that, and it's difficult to grasp because we're always looking for consistency. Which is always hard to find in human behavior, but even more harder to find when you have a foreign policy and domestic policy so radically different from each other. But in 1974, one of his main strategic minds, Jan George Meyer, the prime minister who had been a foreign minister, basically been trained under the royal regime beforehand, who had launched all this, and also Emil Bodnarac, who was a security mind. He passed away in '76. Mao retired in '74. His principal advisor was Elena Ceausescu, who had every bit of the ambition that he had and none of the natural talent for these issues. So there was no, I've yet to see, there might have been, and I haven't been focused so much on internal dynamics, more so about how the Warsaw Pact reacted to Romania, but I have not seen anything out of the Romanian side that shows any consideration of domestic policy, despite all of the U.S. attempts to get them to reconsider.
Wojtek, you need the microphone. Yeah, here it comes.
Well, still about Romania. I have some problems with the last period. You know, once the Soviet Union became the Soviet Union of Gorbachev, yeah? And Ceausescu, in seeking independence from the Soviet Union, is proposing a reform of the Warsaw Pact that would really facilitate intervention in the reformist countries. I mean, that's what the that's what the proposal for the separation of the political and the military is about. He is meeting, of all people, Honecker, and they are agreeing that the dangerous situation is the one in Poland, and that the Warsaw Pact should be made into an instrument that would save the regimes of Eastern Europe from the contagion that is coming from all places in the Soviet Union. So we have now here Ceausescu in a totally different situation, acting in I mean, asserting independence, but in order to preserve the existing regimes.
Perfectly consistent.
Either of you comment? Would you like to start?
It sounds to me perfectly consistent. Ceausescu was preoccupied with his dictatorial sovereignty in Romania, and Soviet hegemony during most of his career was the principal problem. But you get into the mid-'80s, perestroika becomes the principal problem, challenge. It's not at all surprising that he flips here. And you know, I was muttering to Ross during the presentation on Romania. I says, "Gosh, since Ceausescu was such a neat guy, why did he meet such a sorry end?" Well, we know.
Well, you know,
He was not bipolar at all.
he was consistent as bipolar.
He was thoroughly consistent.
Well, to my mind, the jury's still out on this military aspect at the very end. There's some great ambivalencies here, because at the same time, Ceausescu turns right around after his famous meeting with all the Warsaw Pact ambassadors after the Mazowiecki elections. And he's saying that basically he did this because he knows the Soviets are behind the moves in Poland, and this is a signal. But at the same time, what he said, he was also talking about calling these other socialist forum and all the socialist countries, including Yugoslavia and Albania. So there was never any military intervention behind that spiel. Later on in December, in his last meeting with Gorbachev, he specifically mentions that we expected Moscow, because you have influence in Poland, to step in, not militarily. So he underscores that specifically. So I'm not so sure, actually, that he ever crossed that particular line, because that would mean his vulnerability to the max, and he had some major problems. Hungary, especially, was being very vocal about this. In fact, talking about Romanian interventionist plans against it, and in fact, identifying Romania as the main threat for the new Hungarian defense strategy. So I'm not so very sure, and I think the jury's still out. One of the interesting phenomena that occurred after '89 was that many of the same people involved in what I think was probably a disinformation campaign were sort of received an aura of legitimacy because communism was over. And so we go back to the same sources for who was doing this. And so there's...
Very quickly. But at least in the Soviet Politburo, because the Ceausescu proposal after Mazowiecki came, just after, 20th, 21st of August of 1989, and he circulated this appeal for the Warsaw Pact to act. In the Soviet Politburo, that was construed as a proposal for a military crackdown. That's why they, pretty quickly rejected it. So,
this is kind of interesting when you're dealing with this, because there's a pattern here of not referring to what Romania's positions were. You can pick most of the stuff from the documents of the Hungarian or Bulgarian or Czech or Polish documents, but the main documents about the debate, you know, it's not there. At least they haven't shown up yet that I've seen. Mostly you see the most spectacular stuff from the East German side because of how quickly the state and party edifice collapsed. Often you have them misrepresenting entirely the Romanian position, including that they're against removing chemical weapons from Europe, they're against removing nuclear weapons, which was exactly the opposite. I'm not so sure this wasn't the case in that case as well, that here's a great thing to hammer the Romanians over. Now we've got him. Now we've got him in that position. We've got him saying something that we can misconstrue. You look at the Romanian side, there was nothing like any military preparation, no military discussion, nothing of any sort of intervention, nothing different from their national territorial strategy, homeland defense only. So now it's true, the individual, Ceausescu might have said this, and for this reason I wouldn't want to pronounce one or the other because I don't know yet. I'm looking into that right now to try and trace it down. But it might not have been that he was so inconsistent, but it might have been because he wasn't inconsistent because he was actually calling for it or because he wasn't. I'm of two minds myself.
Do we have other questions or comments? Anybody? Doug McCacken, yes. I need a microphone, Doug.
I can try without it.
No, you need it.
Won't get on the web that way.
One factoid question. When you spoke of the Soviet threat of invasion of Poland in 1981, I just wanted to, were you talking about the April threat?
Yeah.
Not December.
Yeah, but the whole thread through the whole year was reluctance.
They were reluctant.
Yes.
Yeah, because I want to turn it around. They weren't the ones threatening Jaruzelski. He was the one begging for them in December.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Oh, no, I quite agree.
Okay,
Yes.
Mircea? Did you ever?
All right, never mind. I actually had a brief comment, and that was there was a lot of discussion here about how the Soviet Union attempted to impose a particular view on its Eastern European allies, and I think to some extent that is generally true. I think at the same time, though, we tend to forget that there's a difference between the Eastern European populations who had a particular view of their role and Soviet domination, and the Eastern European regimes, which did not necessarily have the same view. And in many cases, Eastern European regimes, Romania being a particular exception in many ways, the Eastern European regimes had a very similar view to that of the Soviet Union in terms of political interests, national self-interest, and military self-interest. And I wonder if we're not sort of looking back and sort of forgetting that, you know, this idea of Soviet domination might not have been viewed always at the same level of domination that we're actually putting on right now. That you know, to some extent, the East Germans, the Bulgarians, the Czechs, and even to some extent the Poles and the Hungarians viewed their strategic interest militarily to be, if not exactly the same, but very similar in nature to that of the Soviet Union. And maybe that's where, you know, this idea of the order to go to war from Moscow directly to the national commands was not seen as necessarily a loss of sovereignty. They're sort of like, well, you know, if the Soviets say we're going to war, then, you know, we're going to war because it's in our we have to defend our regimes. I was wondering if you had comments on that.
Any comment? It's a comment. Any well, go ahead.
Yeah, there is a difference in views between the populations and the regimes in Eastern Europe. And clearly, the regimes in Eastern Europe had pretty much the same interest as the Soviets, because after all, they had been put in power essentially by the Soviets and were maintained by them. So they simply didn't have a base, and I think the history of those regimes demonstrates that. Now, as far as the, what was the second part of the question? The last part.
I just said that we tend to look at that from the perspective of history, as in like, well, we know the regimes were bad, and thus, you know, they were bad because they lost that they didn't follow their own national interests. My point was, though, that you know, their definition of national interest differed from that of their own populations, and in the end, I mean, it's the government that makes, you know, the decision as to what the national interest is in terms of military strategy, and that we tend to sort of like put Soviet domination a little bit higher than it necessarily tends to be, that those regimes were actually viewing Moscow as an ally, and their interest matched that of Moscow in more ways than we tend to give them credit for now.
But I think there was a complete division between the governments and the peoples on precisely those views.
I think we have time for one more question or comment, if please, yeah. I'm sorry, did I miss somebody over there or over here? Yeah.
Frank Fletcher. My question for General Yaiko, it is curious. I mean, what you're saying about in your talk was very interesting, that we didn't exploit the divisions in the Warsaw Pact, or even seem to pick up on overtures, even humiliation done by the Soviets. Was this the fault of the intelligence people at certain levels? Was it viewed as disinformation, or just that all communists are the same? Or, I mean, the last question, you know, makes me think of that but certainly we recognize solidarity during the Reagan administration,
well, I mean,
as an
they're
independent.
They're different. It was certainly not the fault of the intelligence community. I mean, they were not the policymakers.
Right.
But I think there was a predilection in the from administration to administration, for example, particularly at State Department, where there was a continuity of looking at Eastern Europe that way. Now, there were things done on Eastern Europe, for example, the radios, which were very useful, very productive, but they didn't fundamentally exploit diplomatic differences or military differences or anything like that. I mean, they put information across, et cetera, and were very successful.
So you think it was at a presidential level, there wasn't the understanding that?
Well, not only that, I think they were generally informed by this view of Eastern Europe that it was a secondary area, that it was not, historically had not been that important to the United States. When we first became engaged there, we very much reflected the British viewpoint, which also the Brits began or looked at Eastern Europe from Moscow's eyes traditionally. And it was an intellectual, cultural thing.
I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank our three panelists. I want to thank, on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the CIA's Information Management Services, Historical Collections Division, for making the documents available. There are more, of course, on foia.cia.gov. We look forward to more documents in the future. We can continue the discussion outside. Please join us for the reception outside. Thank you all for coming.